Hello, welcome to Getting Started With, where our job is to make your job easier. On this episode, we're getting started with Enterprise Risk Management 101 for internal auditors. In this video, you'll learn what enterprise risk management is, why it matters, and how it connects to the work of internal audit. So, let's get started. Think about a ship's captain crossing the ocean. They're not just watching one wave, they're tracking the weather ahead, the depth of the water below, the fuel levels, the crew's schedule, and a dozen other things at once. If they only focused on what was directly in front of them, they'd miss the storm building on the horizon. That's what enterprise risk management is all about. It's the process an organization uses to see the full picture of what could go wrong and what opportunities it might be missing, so it can make smarter decisions. Here's our first term to learn: Enterprise Risk Management, or ERM. The Global Internal Audit Standards define risk management as a process to identify, assess, manage, and control potential events or situations to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of the organization's objectives. When that process happens at the scale of the whole organization, across every department, every function, every level of the business, that's enterprise risk management. In plain terms, ERM is how an organization keeps its eyes open to everything that could knock it off course, and then does something about it. ERM is management's job. It's the organization's leadership, the board, senior management, and the people responsible for risk functions who own the ERM program. They set the strategy. They identify the risks. They decide what to do about them. So where does internal audit fit in? Internal audit provides independent assurance that the ERM program is working. We're not the ones running the ship. We're the ones checking whether the navigation system is reliable. That distinction matters a lot, and we'll come back to it. Why ERM matters to internal auditors comes down to Standard 9.1, Understanding Governance, Risk Management, and Control Processes. The Global Internal Audit Standards are clear on this point. Standard 9.1 requires that the Chief Audit Executive must understand the organization's governance, risk management, and control processes in order to develop an effective internal audit strategy and plan. That means ERM isn't background knowledge, it's foundational. If you don't understand how the organization identifies and manages risk, you can't build a meaningful audit plan. You won't know which risks are most significant, which areas to prioritize, or where the gaps in coverage might be. ERM is the wide-angle lens through which internal audit sees the entire organization. Here's another term to learn: risk appetite. The standards define risk appetite as the types and amount of risk that an organization is willing to accept in the pursuit of its strategies and objectives. In plain terms, it's the organization's answer to the question, how much risk is too much? Every organization has a different risk appetite. A startup might be willing to take big risks to grow fast. A hospital might have an extremely low appetite for risks involving patient safety. Internal auditors need to understand where the organization has drawn those lines, because that's what gives us context when we evaluate whether risks are being managed appropriately. ERM isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing cycle. Organizations continuously identify risks, assess how significant they are, decide how to respond, then monitor whether those responses are working. Think of ERM like the gauges on a car dashboard. The driver doesn't check the fuel gauge once at the start of a road trip and forgets about it. They keep an eye on it throughout the journey. If a warning light comes on, they respond. ERM works the same way. The organization is always monitoring, always adjusting. When organizations identify and assess risks, they typically think across 4 key risk categories: strategic, operational, financial, and compliance. Strategic risks relate to the organization's overall direction and goals. Operational risks relate to processes, people, and systems. Financial risks involve financial reporting, liquidity, and asset protection. And compliance risks relate to laws, regulations, and internal policies. The Global Internal Audit Standards highlight all 4 of these areas as key risk categories internal auditors should consider. Let's learn one more term: risk tolerance. The standards define risk tolerance as acceptable variations in performance related to achieving objectives. If risk appetite is the organization's general comfort level with risk tolerance is more specific. It's the wiggle room. How much can actual performance vary from the plan before someone needs to escalate it? In plain terms, risk appetite sets the boundary, and risk tolerance tells you how close to the edge you're allowed to get. Internal auditors need to know both concepts because they help us evaluate whether management is operating within the limits the board has approved. Not all ERM programs are created equal. Some organizations have a formal, well-documented risk management framework with a chief risk officer, a risk register, defined risk owners, and regular reporting to the board. Others are at an earlier stage where risk conversations happen informally and there's no centralized structure. As an internal auditor, one of your first jobs is to understand the maturity of the ERM program you're working with. The standards require the chief audit executive to assess the maturity of the organization's risk management processes. A more mature program gives you more to rely on. A less mature one may require more caution and more original work by the audit team. Here's a pro tip. Don't assume the presence of a formal ERM program means the program is effective. Your job is to evaluate whether it's working, not just whether it exists. A well-documented program that nobody follows is just paperwork. Look for evidence that risk owners are active, that risk assessments are being updated, and that the results are influencing decisions. There are 3 distinct ways internal audit engages with ERM, and it's important not to confuse them. First, internal audit uses ERM information to build the audit plan. The chief audit executive reviews the organization's risk assessments, risk registers, and risk appetite statements to understand where the significant risks are. In fact, Standard 9.4 requires that the internal audit plan be based on a documented assessment of the organization's strategies, objectives, and risks. So ERM isn't just useful context, it's the foundation the plan has to be built on. Second, internal audit evaluates ERM. Internal auditors assess whether the governance, risk management, and control processes are effective. And third, internal audit does not replace ERM. If internal auditors start managing risks on behalf of the organization, they lose their objectivity. The standards are clear. It is not internal audit's responsibility to resolve the risk. Our job is to report on it. Here's a bright idea. Map your audit plan directly to the organization's risk register to make the connection between audit work and organizational risk visible to stakeholders. When stakeholders can see that each audit engagement connects to a specific identified risk, it makes the value of internal audit much clearer. It also helps the chief audit executive explain to the board why certain areas were prioritized and others weren't. It transforms the audit plan from a list of projects into a strategic response to the organization's risk landscape. When internal audit formally evaluates an ERM program, there are several key questions internal auditors ask. Are significant risks identified and assessed? Are risk owners clearly assigned? Do risk responses align with the risk appetite? Is the board receiving timely and accurate risk information? And are new and emerging risks being captured? The standards also reminds us to consider risks that cross multiple business units, like fraud, technology, and third-party risk, because these can be easy to miss when each department is only looking at its own slice of the organization. Here are some common ERM weaknesses to watch out for. Risks identified but never assigned an owner. A risk register not updated regularly. Risk appetite not formally defined by the board. ERM operating in silos with no enterprise-wide view. And management accepting risks that exceed the appetite without escalating. That last one carries real weight. Standard 11.5 of the Global Internal Audit Standards requires the chief audit executive to communicate unacceptable levels of risk. If management isn't escalating, internal audit may need to. One more term before we wrap up: residual risk. The standards define residual risk as the portion of inherent risk that remains after the management actions are implemented. In plain terms, it's what's left over after the organization has done everything it plans to do about a risk. If the controls are working, residual risk should be lower than the inherent risk. If residual risk is still above the organization's risk tolerance, that's a problem worth flagging. Internal auditors often look at residual risk to evaluate whether the controls in place are making a meaningful difference. Thanks for watching Getting Started with Enterprise Risk Management 101 for Internal Auditors. Next, check out our episodes on getting started with third-party risk and getting started with the audit plan, which both connect directly to what we covered today. You can find these and other helpful resources, including tools, podcasts, and training, at the links below.